We had an unused closet in our house, so we ripped it out, built this bench with sliding doors, these frameless cabinets, and this walnut countertop. Now it's time to get them installed, make a benchtop, add final touches, and figure out one way to make this closet into a mudroom. The first step was to find studs that I could attach my base and cabinets to. I used the stud finder to mark 2 points on each stud, then connected those marks using a level so that I had a line that showed the center of each stud. Then I headed to the shop and used 2x4s to make a toe kick base that would support both my bench and my lower cabinet. I cut the lumber to size and screwed it together using 3-inch screws. I also used a clamp to help hold everything in place while I worked. I'm not going for anything fancy here, just something sturdy enough to hold up the cabinet and bench. The entire base is going to get covered by the end of the project, so looks don't matter here. I built the base about 4 inches more narrow than I did the bench and the cabinet, so that when I add a 1/2-inch board to the face of this, the finished unit will have a 3.5-inch toe kick around everything. I brought the base back upstairs to the mudroom and set it into place. Using a level, I made sure that the base was plumb, then screwed through the base directly into the studs on the sides and the back. Once I was happy with the placement of the base, I moved my lower cabinet and bench into place. Now, just because the bottom of my base is level doesn't mean that the top is. So again, I used shims and a level to properly level the bench and cabinet before securing them into place through the studs. Once my bottoms were taken care of, I moved up to the top and set that cabinet into place as well. Hanging upper cabinets by yourself can be a challenge, but I was lucky in this case because this cabinet was going all the way to the ceiling and abutted a wall on one side, which made me not have to worry about position, only straightness and security. All my casework is now in place, but I have some pretty nasty gaps between the straight boxes and the not so straight walls. Any sheetrock wall will have some inconsistencies in it, but these were pretty extreme, thanks to the fool who mudded these walls. Check out the link above if you'd like to see more of that fool. I had a few options to cover up these gaps. The first was to add caulking to the gaps between the walls and the cabinet, and this ended up causing some big problems that took a lot of time to fix, but I didn't know that at the time. I used a product called Caulk Saver that installs in the gaps before adding your caulking to cut down on the amount you need to use. After taping off the walls, I started to add my caulking and filled in all my gaps. First using the applicator on the tube, then cleaning up a bit with my finger. I waited for the caulking to dry and then applied a second coat to make sure everything was flush. And after this coat dried, that's when I found my problem. I scored the edges of the painter's tape and started to pull it off the walls, but instead of the crisp lines I expected, I got this. The painter's tape was stripping off the finished paint on the walls, and I'm still not entirely sure why this happened. If you have any ideas what might have caused this, let me know in the comments. Regardless of what caused it, I needed to fix it. To do this, I decided to tape my cabinets and use joint compound to fill in the torn sections. Apart from the torn sheetrock, the caulking looked okay, but it still looked like a gap filled with caulking rather than a seamless transition. To try to fix this, I decided to build up my joint compound to cover some of those gaps. I can't say that I've seen this technique used a lot, which is usually a bad sign, but the thought made sense to me. I know my cabinet is straight, so the gaps must be coming from inconsistencies in the wall, meaning I should be able to build out my wall using joint compound, using my cabinet as a guide, and that should leave me with a straight wall and a much smaller gap between the wall and cabinet. I really wasn't sure how this would turn out, but it actually turned out all right. After adding 2 coats of joint compound, then sanding and painting, I was able to strip off the tape and get those clean lines that I had been hoping for this whole time. The small gaps that were left are still filled with the caulking from the last step and aren't very noticeable. Even though it was a frustrating process and took some extra steps, I'm really happy that I took the time and got the clean look that I was going for. My next step was to make a template for my bench top. And for this, I'm using 1/2-inch plywood. I lay out the plywood and push it tight against the cabinet and the walls. Then take smaller pieces of plywood and screw them into the template so that it will keep its shape when removed. My template only has 3 sides, which ended up working fine, but in the future, I'll add a front side as well, just to strengthen everything up a bit. My template is done, but before I can use it, I need to make an oversized panel that will turn into my finished bench top. I'm going to be making this bench top out of walnut to match the countertop that we made earlier. I start by cutting some boards to rough length. My finished bench top will be 48 inches long, so I cut these boards to 52 inches so that I have some room to make mistakes. Once cut, I had hoped to move on to glue up, but after dry fitting these boards together, I noticed some pretty significant gaps between the boards. This means the boards aren't properly milled and need to be before we move on. To do this, I'm using this little benchtop jointer. It's my first time using a jointer, and it was a bit intimidating at first, but also exciting to learn to use a new tool. If you don't have access to a jointer, there are ways you can get straight edges on boards using a table saw. Or you can ask for lumber that's surfaced on at least 2 sides when you buy. First, I edge jointed all my boards, which worked great. Then tried face joining them, which didn't go quite as well. I definitely got some snipe marks, but I did flatten them out. Once my boards were flat and straight, I did another dry fit and everything fit together much better than before, with almost no visible gaps between the boards. Now I could move on to glue up. I laid out my boards on clamps in the order that I wanted them in, then applied and spread glue to the edges of each board. I tightened the bottom clamps and added a couple more on top to keep the panel from bowing. Once secure in its clamps, I let the panel dry for a few hours. Once dry, I removed the top clamps and went to work on cleaning up this panel. My first step was to clean up all the glue squeeze out, and for this I use a chisel, and if you can time it right, this step works best if the glue is almost dry but not completely hard yet. Then I switch to a plane to clean up the seams between each board and make sure that everything is flat. Now that I have an oversized panel, I can grab the template that I made earlier and use it to mark the final size of my bench top. A great option here would be to use this template as a routing guide, using a templating bit to match the shape perfectly. But for this project, I'm just going to mark it and cut to my lines using a straight edge and a circular saw. I clamp my straight edge in place, cut my first side, then repeat this process for the second side. Once my panel is cut to its final length, I move to the table saw and cut it for width. This panel has a few imperfections that I don't want in the final product, mainly this knot which fell out of the edge of the panel while I was cutting it to width. My first step is to tape off any voids that touch an edge, and for this I use tuck tape. There's a few good options to fix issues like this, but I've decided to use black tinted epoxy to fill these sections. I mix equal parts of this Total Boat epoxy resin, then add black pigment and thoroughly mix again. Now comes the satisfying step of pouring the epoxy into the voids, followed by the less satisfying step of waiting 24 hours for it to dry. And while we wait, it would be a great time to give this video a like if you're enjoying it, and to get subscribed to the channel if you haven't yet. And if you have any ideas for projects that you'd like to see me build in the future, leave them in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Once the epoxy was dry, I could remove the tape and give everything another sanding, which turned spots like this into spots like this. I liked the look of these clean, straight lines, but I was afraid that the edge of the bench wouldn't feel great on the back of your legs. So I decided to add a small round over to the bench top using my router with a 3/8 inch round over bit. Then hand sanded to soften the edges. After sanding was done, I moved on to finishing. And just like with the countertop in this room, I'm using Maker brand Simple Finish for this bench top. It's a durable and beautiful finish, and just as important to me, it's very easy to apply. Just pour on, rub in with a clean cotton cloth, wait 15 minutes, apply another light coat, wait another 15 minutes, wipe off the excess, and you're done. With my bench top now finished, I could bring it back to the mudroom and get it installed. After setting it into place and making sure that everything fits well, I used some 1-inch cabinet screws to attach it to the bench from below. Once my bench top was secure, I moved on to the final step, which was to trim out the walls and the toe kick. I marked some 1x4 primed trim and cut it down on the table saw using a crosscut sled. This setup works great for cutting trim, but a miter saw will also work well if you'd prefer. I lay my pieces out and roll on a coat of black paint. I chose black because hopefully it will hide any kick marks and blend in with the shadows underneath this and give it a floating look. Let me know if you think it accomplishes that. I get the toe kick faces installed with some finish nails, then measure and cut the remaining trim for my walls, and install them in the same way. And finally, we can call this project done. It was a long process to get here, from demo to building cabinets, benches, and panels, to getting everything installed and fixing my mistakes. But it was definitely worth it. I absolutely love this room, and seeing those frameless cabinets in place really makes me want to tear out our whole kitchen and redo it in this style. Maybe someday. If you enjoyed the video and haven't seen the rest in this series, check them out and let me know what you think. And as always, thanks so much for watching.